Good morning, beautiful people. I hope you are having a wonderful day so far. I just killed my leg day. Well, it was posterior day, but I just finished with legs, so that's why I'm thinking about legs. Anyways, today's topic is intensity, training intensity, and how hard should you train and form and stuff like that. So first is I get asked all the time about, should I go to failure all the time? Should I train to failure? Do I need to train to failure, etc.? And the first answer that I have with training to failure is yes, you do need to train to failure sometimes. All the time, that's where the question is, how much should you train to failure? Because you do need to train to failure. If you're going to use reps in reserve, right? If you're going to train a couple reps away from failure, you have no idea where one RIR is or two RIR is. One rep away from failure, two reps away from failure, if you never train to failure. So I will always have when clients start working with me, I will always have them train to failure at some point during their time, because I need to know that you actually have the ability to train to failure. Most people are sandbagging their lifts. The funny thing is, a lot of people, especially in the evidence-based crowd, will say that, you should just tell the average Joe that they should always train to failure because people are terrible at gauging reps in reserve, which is not true. It's based on this one study that's a huge study that's basically just a survey of a bunch of people, and it's not really the best methodologically, but we do have a newer study where they had people train and try to guess where 3 reps in reserve was, 2 and 3, I believe, and they were using like 85% of their 1 rep max, and then another group was using 70. And 85% of your 1 rep max is about 10 to 12 reps normally, and 70 is like 20, 25. Like, that's a lot. And they found that, yeah, people are pretty bad when they're doing a ton of reps, which makes sense because at that point you have things like you have cardiovascular demand. You're going to be running out of breath. We've got metabolite buildup. That's that burning sensation inside of your muscles, right? So those things are going to sort of cloud your perception of effort and make it hard to tell when you're actually at failure, when you're failing because of true muscular failure versus these other things. So that's why, of course, everyone says train heavy. And when they say train heavy, that's another thing is heavy when it's considered in the literature is 10 to 12 reps. That's considered heavy. It's not, but I think you should train even lower than that, because we have another meta-analysis on reps in reserve, basically. And it literally, the graph is perfect of people of like whether or not you can train, whether you can accurately predict reps in reserve. And then as soon as you hit 12 reps, that's when it starts to get crazy. So that's another reason why I like to keep training my reps. I like to keep them under 12. 12 is the max that I will ever do, ever. And there's a lot of other reasons for that. I can talk about training heavy in another video. This one's about intensity. So yes, you can accurately gauge reps in reserve, and it's a skill just like everything else. But again, you do need to train to failure occasionally to know where 1 rep away from failure is. Should you train to failure on every set? Well, in my personal opinion, no. We have seen, again, on the training to failure meta-analysis, there's 2 of them now. There's 2 training to failure study, and they basically meta-analysis where they gather a whole bunch of studies up and they look at the results. They try to build a statistical model based off of it. So we have 2 meta-analyses looking at training to failure, and they both found that last rep, those last 1 to 2 reps are doing, yes, you are getting more stimulus, right? Training to failure will always give you more stimulus than 1 to 2 reps in reserve, but it's going to give you significantly more fatigue, mainly in the form of central nervous system fatigue, which is think about it as just perception of effort is the best way to say it, is the best way to dumb down central nervous system fatigue. So there's a lot of different things that go into it. You can just think of it as perception of effort. And I'm sure you've noticed this just anecdotally within your own training. That last rep, especially if it's a huge grinder, sucks and it cooks you. So the extra stimulus that you're getting from that compared to the fatigue, that stimulus fatigue ratio that everyone cries about, is not good. The stimulus fatigue ratio on that last rep is terrible. So my practical recommendation is when you're doing 2 or more sets on anything, and 3 is the most sets that I'll ever do for one exercise. I think once you're doing anything else, you should just do something else, try and challenge it in a different way. For example, I do 3 sets for triceps, and I don't do them all in the same machine. I do 1 JM press, 1 overhead, and 1 with a neutral Do you have to do all of that? No. But I'm just saying, if you're going to do multiple sets, you might as well try and challenge the muscle in a slightly different way. That's my personal philosophy. Anyways, if you're doing more than 2 sets, if you're doing 2 or more sets, you should do about what I like to program is 1 rep in reserve for that first set and then 0 for the second one. So ideally, you're getting the same amount of reps on each set. So the way that would look is I do 1 set and I get, let's say 7 reps, and I quit with 1 rep in the tank. Then on my second set, right, I'm going to push again. And this time I'm going to go until I have 0 reps in reserve. And the way I like to classify 0 reps in reserve is that you don't go for that last partial. You don't actually fail the lift. You stop when you think you would not be able to get that last one. So you don't actually go for the rep and do like a lengthened partial, basically. And ideally, you get that same amount of reps because you're going to lose 1 to 2 reps after each subsequent set based on fatigue. That's how fatigue works. And especially if you're training hard. If you're not, that's a good time. So you get 7 reps on the first set with 1 rep in reserve. Then you should ideally get 7 reps again on the second set when you train with 0 reps in reserve, right? Because if you had 1 rep in reserve again, then you would go 7 and 6. Or if we were training to failure on both sets, it would be 7 and 6. But since we're changing the reps in reserve, we get 7 and 7. We might get 7 and 6 again because there is different levels of fatigue and you didn't rest long enough. Who cares? But that's how I like to practically program it, is 1 rep in reserve on the first one, 0 on the second. I also like to scale intensity with my mesocycles. I am a believer in mesocycles, at least to start. I don't think the periodization literature is very bad. So that's basically where you switch up your program every 12 weeks. But I am a fan of it just in the sense of longevity and joints and loading in terms of that. Because if we know that from the reps in reserve literature, we know that the hypertrophy is basically the same. It does slightly favor training to failure. So that's why I don't like to have people live past 1 rep in reserve, because we do see slightly greater hypertrophy, again, maybe with training to failure. So I don't like to go above 1 rep in reserve, except on the first week of a new program. On the first week of a new program, I'm going to have you train with 1 to 2 reps in reserve because we have new movements that we're learning. And those are going to inherently be more fatiguing. They're going to make you more sore because you're challenging things in different ways, right? Soreness is almost always, if there's one thing that soreness is an indicator of, it's novelty, it's newness. And when you're doing new exercises, new movements, learning new motor patterns, you have the higher chance of getting injured because you're trying something new. I just like that first week. And again, we know that 2 reps in reserve is still going to be plenty stimulating. You're still going to grow, maybe just as much as going to failure. So you're not really leaving any gains on the table by leaving 1 to 2 reps in reserve. And again, I still give a prescription of 1 to 2. It's just that I really don't want you training to failure on your first week of a new block. And again, mainly for the reasons that I was talking about. I don't want you being super sore. Okay, thank you. I don't want you being super sore, and I don't want you getting hurt, and I want you just getting good form, because a lot of times form is what suffers with intensity. The way that I like to view form and intensity is it's sort of on a line. It's sort of on a spectrum, right? Because if you're going, for most people, that's how it is. For most people, the harder they train, the worse their form is going to get, right? You see this all the time. It's a trade-off that doesn't necessarily have to happen, but it's an observed phenomenon. And I think you should have good form. You should have as good a form as you possibly can. It should be damn near robotic, especially your first rep. Your first rep should be robotic, should be pristine. And your last rep should be damn near that. But if you have a little form deviation just because you're trying really hard, that's totally fine. Just don't track that rep. So if I was talking about this with Jackson, with Scientifically Jacked, and he gave lat pull downs for an example. If you're doing lat pull downs and you look great throughout the whole set, and then that last rep, you're really pushing and your shoulders kind of round forward, that's totally fine to do that, especially if you are training on that 0 reps in reserve set, but just don't count that rep. Because the thing about having good form is good form inherently, there's nothing inherently good about good form. right? Obviously, we have injury prevention and stuff like that. But the main reason why we want to have good standardized form is just so that we have something to track, something that we can look over week after week. Because if your form is changing every week, then you don't know if you're actually progressing or not, or if you're just changing your form more and more. Same thing with using momentum, for example. One study that compared cheat reps to strict form, and they did bicep curls and tricep extensions, and they found similar hypertrophy across groups. So you can interpret that one of two different ways, right? The first way is you can say, oh, perfect, I can cheat and have terrible form and get just as good of gains as the guy who has robotic form. And I will not fault you for interpreting the findings that way. But you can also interpret it as I can have perfect robotic form and still make just as many gains as the guy who is cheating. And I guarantee you that your version of perfect robotic form is not anywhere near how robotic and perfect the form was in that lab setting. Because just imagine you're working out in a lab with researchers all around you telling you exactly how to perform this movement, and it's a single joint movement, and you have like three dudes just staring at you. You know, they got their clipboards. I mean, it's a modern era, so they probably have iPads, and they're just staring at you. You're probably gonna have pristine form. It's gonna be so good. It's gonna be better than the best form you've ever had in your life. Best looking bicep curl you've ever had. Textbook. So I promise you that you just thinking and trying to have good form throughout a whole set is you're going to make just as many gains as the guy who's swinging his dumbbells around. And you're probably also going to be a lot less fatigued. And again, you can actually track your progress better because we want to be growing muscle. We don't just want to be seeing the numbers go up in the logbook. If the numbers are going up in the logbook, that's cool. That'll give your brain some dopamine for sure. But is that the goal? No, the goal is to get jacked. Or, I mean, I don't know what your goal is. That's mine. That's what most of you, I'm assuming it is to get jacked. And just by seeing the numbers go up on the logbook does not mean you're getting jacked if your form is changing every time. So that's kind of how I like to view form is, yeah, I want you going hard. I want you, and I tell my clients, I would rather have you overshoot than undershoot with your reps in reserve. Like I would rather have you accidentally go to failure so if you're trying to get 1 rep in reserve, I'd rather have you accidentally go 0 than accidentally go 2. But again, when you're using heavy loads, it's so easy to track your reps in reserve. And that's the thing is, if you do end up having a bad rep, just don't track it. Just don't put it in the logbook. Don't count it. And that can be hard on the ego, but that's just how it is. So in conclusion, right? Yes. And I didn't even touch on how often you should be training to failure. I said it was every other set, but if you have something that's just one set, I say go to 0 reps in reserve. I really haven't like I said, in the literature, we don't see that much of a difference. And anecdotally, I don't see that much of a difference. And especially if you only have one set of the exercise, you don't have to worry about that fatigue from going to failure carrying over and affecting your other lifts. So that's what I would say. And then again, if you're not progressing, yeah, maybe you have to push it back a little bit. But that's the thing is, I would rather have you push those limits first, and then we can ease off the gas if we need to. And that's why we have volume, we have intensity, and we have frequency. All three of those things, those are three levers that interplay with each other. So maybe, and if you're doing if you're doing super high frequency, if you're doing 3 times frequency or 3.5 times frequency, you probably shouldn't be training to failure that often because you're back in the gym every other day, basically. You're training that muscle every other day. And if you're doing a ton of volume, yeah, you probably shouldn't be going to failure every time. But again, if you're doing single sets, you probably should be going harder. They all just kind of interplay with each other. The higher the volume, you're likely going to have to lower the frequency or lower the intensity or maybe both. If you're doing lower volume, you're going to have to decrease the frequency or increase the volume. They all play with each other. They all are interchangeable. And that's the key. That's why programming is hard. That's why people get coaches, because you want to compare your rates of progression when you're training with reps in reserve, when you're training with different frequencies, when you're training with different intensities and different volumes, so you can actually know what works best for you, right? Some people, and it's also with train to failure, it's going to depend on your cardiovascular health as well, how fast you can recover. And training to failure is going to make you're going to have to rest a little bit longer, just again, because it's so much more fatiguing. There's a graph from the study that I'm referencing of the train to failure meta-analysis. And it's basically the stimulus it's the neuromuscular fatigue is on one side and then the stimulus is on the other. And they're both going up. And then that last rep goes down, and they have this this little span area that covers the last 3 reps. And it's like, these are the huge neuromuscular fatigue zone. And that's the truth of it, right? And again, I don't want to fearmonger fatigue. I don't want to say that fatigue, it's this fatigue demon that you need to be super afraid of. But at the end of the day, most of the time, that's why you're not progressing, right? Because always, always, always remember, the floor for growth is so small. It's 1 set twice a week with 2 reps in reserve. That is how small, that is how much is needed to grow in trained individuals. And yes, everyone talks about this because it's from one study as if it's the silver bullet for training volume. But we have other studies showing growth in trained lifters doing 1 set 3 times a week. So it's like, that's why the reason why everyone cites this one study of 1 set 2 times a week, or 1 set twice a week with 2 reps in reserve, is because I can almost guarantee you that you're doing more than that. Pretty much everyone is doing more than that. And so that's why we know that throwing more volume at the equation is almost never the problem, right? It's just like I covered a study yesterday, and it has, they took people's habitual volumes. They looked at how many sets they were already doing for quads. And they took one leg and they had them increase their volume by 20%, and they had them increase the volume on the other leg by 120%. So they more than doubled their weekly sets. And they didn't see any increases in hypertrophy. There was also no differences between the two. The only differences between the two groups were when they took a muscle biopsy, when they literally cut out a chunk of their muscle, they saw that the group that did more than doubled their volume had more CALP1, which is a calpain, and that is it's indicated with muscle breakdown, with muscle damage. So that's what we saw and then there was another protein that was higher, but essentially we see 0 increases in hypertrophy and a small increase in damage. So volume is almost never the problem. It's almost always that you're doing either too much, you're training too hard, or you're training too frequently. And that is why you hire a coach. Anyways, that is all for today, folks. Train hard, go to failure. Probably not on every set, but you do still need to go to failure. Have good form, but not robotic. As always, the answer is it depends. Peace out. Love y'all.